Ex-police officer David Paulides' series of books entitled Missing 411 took the world by storm when they were first released, as they attempt to answer some of the vexing questions that we have about people who disappeared in the wilderness, never to be seen again. While most of these cases still have not been solved, we now know more about the circumstances surrounding these bizarre disappearances, and if nothing else, renewed attention was brought to these investigations, some of which are decades old. Number 10. 64-year-old Emerson Carbaugh's disappearance, which took place on the 11th of November, 1985, is one of the better-known missing 411 cases, thanks to the strange details that came to light after he went missing. On that day, he and his brother, Ralph Issett, decided to head out to Robertsdale, Pennsylvania, when they traveled into the mountains to hunt for turkeys. When they reached Broad Top Mountain at around 2 p.m., they stopped in a field next to a logging road, and from there headed in opposite directions. They agreed to meet back up at Emerson's truck at a specific time that afternoon, and as they set out into the woods, a light rain had started to fall. Emerson, also known as Red, was well equipped for the outing, wearing a camouflage coat with brown duck hunting pants, a warm sweater, and black boots. He was carrying a Remington 870 pump-action firearm with him, in case he came across some turkeys, and according to Issett, everything seemed as it should, and Red was in high spirits when he last saw him. With his hunting done for the day, Issett headed back to the truck later that afternoon, but to his surprise, Red didn't make it back at their agreed-upon time. He decided to wait a little longer, and when it started to get dark, he became concerned that something may have happened to Red. He fired 6 shots into the air in case Red had somehow gotten lost, but 10 minutes later, he still hadn't emerged from the woods. Fearing the worst, he decided to leave the truck where it was and headed out on foot to find help. By the time Red was reported missing, complete darkness had descended on the mountain, and no search was conducted. But the next morning, a group of local volunteer firefighters arrived and started to comb the area, but to no avail. The area where Red went missing is about 12 square acres in size, and to ensure that no part of it was left unchecked, volunteer searchers joined arms and combed the woods, hoping to at least find some clue as to where Red may have gone. Search dogs were brought in to aid in the effort. Helicopters with infrared cameras searched from the air, and scuba divers searched every body of water in the area, but still, Red remained missing. More than 1,800 people would end up traversing the woods, but despite their best efforts, couldn't find a single clue to point them in the right direction, and eventually the search had to be called off. What strikes most people who are familiar with Red's case as strange is the fact that none of his equipment, clothing, or supplies were ever found, which is truly bizarre when it comes to these types of cases. Making the mystery even more intriguing, Red's wife, Ida, contacted the police in 2004, 19 years after her husband disappeared, and reported that she was contacted by someone who claimed to know what happened that day. They told her that Red's life was ended that day and that his remains were buried on a farm in the Robertsdale area. They added that they found a small bone in the area, which was then processed by the police, but due to its small size, it could not be properly analyzed. The only other piece of information in this case is that Issett saw a few hunters loading turkeys onto their truck in the area that same day, but it isn't known whether they're involved in Red's disappearance since they were never identified. The Pennsylvania State Police welcome any tips that come in, and they can be submitted by dialing 814-627-3161. Number 9. While people disappearing from national parks and other remote areas is nothing new, these cases always contain elements of intrigue, and the disappearance of 69-year-old Sylvia Apps, which occurred on the 8th of July, 2014, is no exception. At the time, Sylvia hailed from Courtenay in British Columbia, Canada, and she decided to go on a solo hiking trip that would last 5 days in Strathcona Park, which is located on Vancouver Island. She was by no means out of her element, since she was an experienced hiker, and on this trip she was well prepared as she had safety and navigational equipment with her. Her friends and family weren't worried that she'd be spending 5 days in the wilderness on her own, as she was well acquainted with the outdoors. Before she set out on her trip, she told her family she'd be back home at around 4 p.m. on the 13th of July, but this never happened and she was reported as missing. The resulting search would leave searchers baffled. Searchers from many different areas and organizations joined the effort, which started in the Castle Crag mountain area with the help of a helicopter. The areas where Sylvia was most likely to have traveled were also searched thoroughly, but with no results. It was determined that she'd reached the summit of Castle Crag Mountain, since she signed the register there on the 10th of July. But frustratingly, no one came forward to report that they had seen her. Thus, it was impossible to tell which direction she hiked in after leaving the mountain. The initial search lasted a week, after which it was scaled back since no clues were found, and the chances that Sylvia had survived that long had become very slim. Searchers stated that they always felt as though they were close to finding her, but came up empty after every search. In mid-July, Sylvia's backpack was found, and when it was searched, it still had all of her belongings inside, except for her walking poles and camera. Her camera and poles would be found later in a completely different area, and it's been speculated that she dropped these items and spent some time searching for them. This was a first for the Cummocks Valley Search and Rescue crew, who were at the forefront of the search, as they stated after the fact that they'd never been involved in a search where all of the missing person's belongings were found, but they were not. This also had an effect on Sylvia's family, since they were hopeful that she would be located when her belongings were discovered, but on both occasions, the clues that were found led nowhere. Sylvia has never been found, and the Cummocks Valley RCMP have asked that anyone with further information contact them at 250-338-1321. Number 8. 22-year-old David Barclay Miller disappeared on the 19th of May, 1998, while he was on a 2.5-day hiking trip in Arizona, and to this day his fate remains unknown. At the time of his disappearance, David had been working for the National Forest Service for 2 months. He was employed as a ranger for the Coconino National Forest in Arizona, and on the day that he disappeared, his coworkers saw him at the Beaver Creek Ranger Station. That evening, he left the station on his own, and later his colleagues found a note that he'd left behind that stated he was planning on going on a hike in the Red Rock and Secret Mountain wilderness areas. When he didn't return to the ranger station on the 22nd of May as planned, his coworkers realized that something was wrong and a missing person case was opened. A search was immediately started, and hopes were high that he would be found, since he was an experienced outdoorsman who would likely be able to survive in the wilderness for some time. And added to that was the fact that his coworkers were all very familiar with the surrounding area. David's truck was eventually found at the Vultee Arch Trail near Sedona, and while this was a good sign, searchers became ever more concerned as time went by, since that area is known to be very hot and dry, and it's assumed that David did not have enough drinking water with him to survive for very long. What makes this case even stranger is the fact that the Vultee Arch Trail is very popular, and hence sees a lot of people hiking the area on a daily basis. But despite this, no witnesses came forward to report that they had seen or spoken to David. This has led many people to believe that he wasn't actually hiking that trail when he went missing, since none of his equipment or clothing was ever found on the 3.6-mile trail. Even weirder is the fact that his campsite was never found, since he was planning on spending more than one night under the stars and would have had to make camp at some point. Furthermore, when David realized that he was in trouble, his experience would have caused him to turn back to civilization, especially if he was rapidly running out of water. But it seems that this is not the case. His disappearance has resulted in a lot of speculation, since many of the facts just don't seem to make any sense. Why did he merely leave a note at the ranger station, rather than report his plans to his immediate superior? In the years that have passed, no further clues have been found, leaving David's fate as an unexplained mystery, and investigators have asked that anyone with additional information come forward by contacting the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office at 928-771-3260. Number 7. When 25-year-old David O'Sullivan flew from Ireland to the United States, he was on the cusp of living out one of his biggest dreams, to hike the Pacific Crest Trail that stretches from the border between California and Mexico to the border between Washington and Canada. Like many others before him, he'd read the book Wild: From Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail, which was written by Cheryl Strayed, and was later made into a movie starring Reese Witherspoon. He found the book inspirational, leading to his plans to take on the 2,653-mile journey that would ultimately cause his disappearance. Shortly before setting off on his adventure, David had graduated from University College Cork, where he'd been studying philosophy and English. Following this, he started working at a gas station in Middleton to save up for his trip. He was an experienced hiker, since his training saw him cover many miles across different parts of Ireland. And in the spring of 2017, he felt he was ready. By April of that year, he'd hiked to Idlewild in Riverside County, and from there, he emailed his family to update them on his progress. He added that he was replenishing his supplies and that the hike had gone well so far, adding to his excitement to continue. Many people believe that despite his intense training in Ireland, David was ill-prepared for the mountains that are found on the Pacific Crest Trail, and had even less experience hiking through snowy conditions. Weather reports from the area at that time showed that as many as 3 feet of snow were expected during the next part of David's hike, but he continued regardless. A hiker that ran into David at one point told investigators that he was looking somewhat the worse for wear, and that the conditions on the trail had seemingly taken a toll on him. They encouraged him to go as far as he could, but to call it a day if he felt that he was in over his head. But on the 7th of April that year, he forged ahead and started out towards the San Jacinto Mountains. His family never received another email from him, but he told them that he might be out of touch for prolonged periods at certain times, so at first they weren't too concerned. But when he failed to make contact by May, they started to worry that something may have happened to him. They contacted the police in Ireland, but there wasn't much they could do. They posted to the Pacific Crest Trail Facebook group in case someone had recently seen David, but got no response. When another month had gone by without any word from the missing man, they contacted the Washington-based Irish consulate, and a missing person case was opened. But most people feel that by this point, David had been missing for far too long. Several searches were conducted on the trail, but no clue as to his whereabouts was ever found. Furthermore, since David was hiking alone, no one can say with any certainty how far he had hiked before running into trouble. There's been speculation that he simply vanished of his own accord, but since he was seen hiking the trail, this seems very unlikely. Whatever the case may be, David's case remains unsolved, and we may never learn what happened to him while he was out living one of his biggest dreams. Number 6. The Mount Hood National Forest has been the site of many a disappearance, and many of those missing people have never been located. One such case involves 57-year-old Robert Bissell, who hailed from Portland, Oregon. Robert's case started in July of 2010 when he traveled to Estacada, where he planned to go camping in the Roaring River Wilderness area. Like so many hikers that disappear, he was an experienced outdoorsman, but unlike many campers, he usually spent his time in nature on his own, something that many wilderness experts see as a very bad idea. Nevertheless, Robert's love of fishing, hiking, and solitude never wavered, and after arriving in the area, he filed for a wilderness use permit and informed the U.S. Forest Service that he planned to be out in nature until the 16th of July. Following this, he drove to Trailhead 700, which is located close to Rock Lakes, and set out on a hike. He walked about 5 miles before deciding to set up camp a short distance from Trail 512, but he didn't stay there long. It's believed that he then went on another hike after deciding to go fishing, as his campsite was later found looking as though he'd planned to be away from it for a day at most, since his sleeping bag and other belongings were still there. The only items that were missing were his fishing rod and tackle. When Robert didn't return by the 16th of July, his brother became concerned and traveled to the campsite on both the 19th and 24th of July, but could find no sign of him. He filed a missing person report, and for the next 8 days, the area was searched by the Clackamas County Sheriff's Search and Rescue Department. They concentrated their efforts on the Roaring River Wilderness, Rock Lakes Basin, and Serene Lake areas before also searching Shining Lake and Shell Rock Lake, all to no avail. Several campers had seen Robert in the Roaring River's wilderness area before he vanished, and reported that he stated he'd only just arrived in the area. He also mentioned via a note that he was heading to the Roaring River's wilderness area to do some trout fishing, adding that he would be back soon. Searchers were confident that they would find Robert, since temperatures at the time were moderate to cool, and since he was no stranger to the outdoors, but despite the best efforts of hundreds of volunteers and many professional searchers, nothing was found. Robert's disappearance remains a mystery. Anyone who has any information on his case can contact the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office at 503-785-5000. Number 5. Christopher Lynn Holverson, known to his friends and family as Chris, was about to celebrate his 19th birthday when he suddenly disappeared on the 17th of May, 1998. He'd graduated from Skyline High School in Idaho Falls the previous year and had started a job at a Mexican restaurant. Chris was described as a kind and understanding person, but at the time his parents were in the process of getting divorced, something that he reportedly took very hard, since his friends and family could tell that it upset him. Then on the 17th of May of that year, he and a group of friends decided to go camping in the Targhee National Forest, specifically at Table Rock Campground. He drove his vehicle, a Chevrolet pickup, to a friend's house, where he then left it since he was planning on traveling to the site in his friend's car. Many people believe that it was a bad idea for the group to head out that night, since temperatures in the area had dropped dramatically. Some snow had already fallen, and that night sleet was expected. Nevertheless, the group continued with their plans, and according to many witnesses, they soon started partying. It would later come to light that some members of the group were using illegal substances, despite there only being one other adult present. Thanks to freezing temperatures, most of the group was inside a tent, and eventually Chris decided to step outside, possibly to get some fresh air. As he left the tent, he tripped over a rope and the group heckled him, though they claim they did it in good spirits. Conflicting statements were given about what happened next. Some members of the group stated that Chris simply walked off into the woods, never to return, but a few others claimed that he'd gotten into an altercation with one or more of his friends before leaving the area. But they did add that it wasn't out of character for Chris to suddenly leave, since he'd done so many times in the past, but this was the first time that he didn't come back. The group eventually decided to contact the authorities, and Chris was reported missing. The area was searched, but no trace of him was found, leaving investigators to question the group about their activities that night. Chris's father would later report that he'd found illegal substances in Chris's room after he vanished, but it still isn't clear whether he was under the influence of anything that night. When the search failed to produce any positive results, the police reached out to any potential witnesses, and a driver came forward to report that he'd seen a man fitting Chris's description walking around the campground. The man was of the same height, around 6'2", and was wearing a blue tracksuit with stripes down the sides, just as Chris was. It was never fully confirmed whether this was indeed Chris, but investigators feel relatively certain that it was him. When one of his friend's driveway was checked for Chris's Chevrolet truck, it was found to still be parked there, and the case quickly went cold as no further leads were found. It's been suggested that Chris was angry about the fight that he had with his friends, and that he had walked off, completely underestimating the icy conditions out in the woods. If this is the case, he would have quickly become hypothermic, since he was only wearing a thin jacket over his tracksuit. But if this was the case, he would not have gotten far, and would likely have been found pretty quickly once the authorities were informed. But whatever the case may be, Chris remains missing to this day, his fate unknown. If you know what happened at the campsite that night, you're asked to contact the Madison County Sheriff's Office at 208-356-5426. Number 4. 50-year-old journalist Keith Young's disappearance is one of the strangest on the missing 411 list, since he vanished while writing a book about another man, Tom Young, who had also mysteriously vanished a year earlier. Young's story starts in 1969, when he moved to Silver Plume in Colorado, having retired from a career in teaching. He chose a house on the south side of Pendleton Mountain, known to locals as the dark side of town, since the sun never reached that area. He and his dog, Gus, lived on the mountain alone. But during the day, he traveled into town to run a bookshop that he'd opened on the main street. But on the 7th of September, 1987, he finished up business for the day, locked the bookstore's doors behind him, and vanished into thin air, along with Gus, never to be seen alive again. The case would get very bizarre though, as he was found deceased almost a year later after having been attacked with a firearm. Close to his body, investigators found shredded pieces of tarp, and it's believed that he was moved to the mountain after his life had been ended. This story must have struck a chord with Keith Reinhard, since he decided to start writing a book about the case the next year. He relocated to Silver Plume and rented the very same bookstore that Tom owned before vanishing. To do this, he had to take a 3-month break from his usual job as a sports writer for the Daily Herald, which is based in Chicago. According to those who knew Keith, he'd started obsessing about the case, and when Tom's remains were discovered, he told several people that he was planning on hiking to the top of Mount Pendleton. His family found this strange, since he was known to suffer from a fear of heights, and locals in the area also thought this was a bad idea since he was ill-prepared for the trip. They knew that it would take him at least 6 hours to reach the top and come back down. So when he announced that he'd be setting out at 5 p.m. on the 7th of August that year, they were concerned for his safety, since he would never have made it back to town before dark. Their fears were confirmed when he failed to arrive in town that night, and a search was launched that lasted for the next week. More than 200 people scoured the mountainside, hoping to find even just a shred of his clothing, but that wasn't the case. When his apartment was searched, the unfinished novel was found inside, but it soon became clear that the last few pieces of writing closely resembled his own disappearance, leading many people to believe that he had intentionally disappeared, either to drum up publicity for the book or as a hoax. And investigators have asked that anyone with information on this case come forward by contacting the Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office at 303-679-2376. Number 3. 71-year-old Brian Lee Johnson's disappearance is yet another case of someone going missing in one of the U.S.'s national parks, never to be found. In this case, he traveled to the Olympic National Park in Washington State in August of 2013, where he was planning on spending 3 days on the Ozette Loop Trail. Brian's wife would later tell the authorities that she woke up on the 22nd of August of that year and found a note that Brian had left, in which she explained that he didn't want to wake her, and he planned on driving from their house in Seattle to the park in Washington State to spend some time out in nature. The trail is made up of 3 3-mile sections that wouldn't have posed much of a challenge to Brian, since he was physically fit and had spent a lot of time out in the wilderness throughout his life. When he hadn't come home by the 28th of August, his wife and the rest of his family felt that something was wrong, and they filed a missing person report. At first, there wasn't too much concern, since the trail that he intended on hiking is easygoing, and not many people get lost while using it. For the following 3 days, 50 people, including park rangers, searched for Brian, but since the trail was a very long one, it quickly became apparent that he was in trouble as no sign of him was found. It was believed that he was still in the area since his truck was still parked at the Ozette trailhead, but when all of the searches proved to be fruitless, they were eventually called off without any sign of him being found. When it was suggested that Brian simply left the trail and vanished intentionally, his family stated that they didn't believe this to be the case, since he'd not been having any trouble at home and seemingly had no reason to want to disappear. But many people pointed out that Brian was a very reserved and quiet person who enjoyed being alone, and hence there was no telling what he was thinking before setting out on the hike that morning. They've suggested that he may have gotten bored on the trail and decided to try out a few others, where he then either got lost or injured and couldn't make his way back to the trailhead. He may have also decided to hike in a different area before ever starting on the Ozette Loop Trail, but all of this remains speculation, since no evidence has ever been found to prove either theory or any others. Brian's disappearance continues to baffle investigators, and they've asked that anyone who saw Brian on the trail while he was there, or who has any information on his whereabouts, contact Olympic National Park Rangers at 360-565-3120. Number 2. In 1997, 27-year-old Chad Hansen was living in Wilkeston, Washington, and he developed a love for photography, especially when he had the chance to take photos out in nature. It was with this in mind that he traveled to Mount Rainier in November of that year, but he was never seen again. On the 11th of November, Chet told his mother of his plans, and at 6:30 a.m., he said goodbye to her as he set out on his trip. He assured her that he wouldn't be staying over at the park and that he would be back in time for dinner that evening. She told investigators that he loaded about 35 pounds worth of photography equipment into his car, and that he was only wearing a fleece, shorts, and hiking boots. He failed to make it back in time for dinner, but his parents assumed that he'd decided to stay over at a friend's house that night. But on the 12th of November, they were contacted by his manager at Alaska Airways when he failed to show up for his shift, which was supposed to start at 2:30 p.m., and they immediately started to worry that he might have gotten lost or injured while hiking. They contacted the police and informed them of the situation, after which a missing person case was opened. The first search effort was conducted by Chet's friends and family, who found his car parked at Deer Creek Falls trailhead. Inside, investigators found some negatives, his house keys, a few papers, and the case in which he kept his glasses. One of the negatives was found to be a photo of the Tipsoo Lake area, while another showed that he had traveled along Highway 410. His family told searchers and investigators that Chet knew the area very well, since he'd spent a lot of time out there in the past, but they added that he rarely remained on the trails, since he tried to avoid tourists and was always looking for areas to photograph that he had never explored before. At the time when he went missing, he had taken a keen interest in taking photos of waterfalls and lakes. This gave searchers a good idea of the areas to be searched, but despite this valuable information, he remained missing. If Chet had decided to hike off the trail once more, it may have been the decision that sealed his fate, since searchers were now focusing on areas with lakes and waterfalls when he may have been heading in a completely different direction. Two witnesses, Willard Olson and his girlfriend, would later inform the police that they were out in the park that day and that they had seen someone who was dressed similarly to Chet on the 11th of November near Shriner Peak, and who had the same physical characteristics, but they couldn't say with certainty that it was him that they saw. More than 100 people took to the trails in the park to look for Chet, but they eventually had to give up when not a single clue of his whereabouts was ever found. If you or anyone you know has any information on Chet's case, you're asked to contact the Pierce County Sheriff's Office at 253-798-7530. Number 1. The disappearance of 28-year-old Jessica Staggs is a case with many strange twists and turns, but it's also one that remains unsolved after she and her boyfriend, 45-year-old Jerry Baggett, celebrated New Year's Day on a flat-bottom boat in the Tallahatchie River. The details about what happened that day are vague at best, since Jerry has changed his account of the day's events, leading many people to believe that he's been less than truthful for reasons unknown. The case started on the 1st of January, 2021, when Jessica and Jerry got into his truck and towed a boat to the river, which is located in Mississippi. Investigators know for certain that this is the case since the couple was captured by security cameras at the Pullville Quick Stop convenience store at around 5:30 that morning as they drove through the area. They planned to travel to the river to look for deer and wild hogs that sometimes become trapped when it floods, and to enjoy the warm weather that the area had been experiencing at the time. They decided to launch the boat at County Road 46 and then float downstream for about 4 miles to the Rocky Ford Bridge. They had no means to get back, and so decided to leave Jessica's phone with one of her friends so that they could phone her to come pick them up once they were ready. But according to Jerry, Jessica became concerned when they entered the water and found it to be flowing much faster than usual. When they'd floated about 2 miles downstream, she asked that he take the boat to shore so that she could get out, which he says he then did. Once she was on dry land, she told him that she was going to walk back to County Road 46, and he claims that he then floated to the opposite bank, where he got out and called one of his friends to get him. When Jessica hadn't contacted her friend by 10:15 that night, she was reported missing, but strangely, Jerry was not the one to do so. A search was immediately started, but when she was still missing by 2 a.m. the next morning, it was called off. It continued at sunrise that morning, but by this time, the area had been flooded, and it was only the next day that a proper search could be carried out. Drones were used to search from the air, while volunteers and professional searchers scoured the riverbank, but with no result. That's when the case took a strange turn. Some of Jessica's belongings were found, along with her footprints, just inside the border of the Holly Springs National Forest. The prints were followed as they led to County Road 46, but they then suddenly turned north after about 100 yards, indicating that she suddenly started walking towards Highway 30 for some reason. They were followed into a field that had been newly flooded, and hence the trail went cold. A woman's boots were later found with their tops cut off, along with a shovel, which had a broken handle, but it isn't certain whether these items belonged to Jessica. but it is known that the couple was using shovels instead of oars that day. Jerry would later change his story, telling investigators that the boat had started taking on water, and after stopping at the shore to empty some of it, the boat suddenly started moving, and Jessica was unintentionally left behind. It's also been speculated that Jessica was never in Jerry's truck that morning, and that he had something to do with her disappearance, but this remains speculation. Jessica has never been found, and her case remains open. Anyone with helpful information on her case is urged to contact the Union County Sheriff's Office at 662-534-1943. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.